Live.
Welcome to Leveling Up Season 2, Episode 4, Old School Gaming versus New School Gaming. I'm VP Quinn, and this is our Chief Operations Officer, Josh. You can find High Level Games on all our media platforms and social media accounts, from our Facebook page, conveniently titled High Level Games, our Twitter account at HLG_corporate, our YouTube channel, also called High Level Games, and finally our Twitch channel, High_level_games.
You can also find us in two really amazing places doing amazing things that we're going to talk a little bit more about, and that is HLGcon.com and our Kickstarter, which is bringing HLGcon to the next level. So High Level Games is running a convention in Atlantic City, October 12th through the 14th. We've got tabletop games, we've got LARP, we've got board games. We've got so many awesome events that are going to be going on there that it's hard to figure out what to talk about first. But I would definitely say check out hlgcon.com if you want to learn some more. Quinn, do you have any questions that are coming to mind about things that you want to know more about regarding the convention?
I not so much questions. If you haven't gone on to hlgcon.com and looked at the space we're going to be in, this old cool casino that we're going to be able to game in, it is amazing. We have amazing celebrity gamers and game designers and people coming, and I know that I'm really excited. I'm going to be running a game of Dread for a few folks. I'm really excited to run that and try to scare the heck out of people. I've run through that session with Josh once when we were
Which
at
was
Gen Con last.
amazing. It still gives me chills to think about it as a game that actually got me close to being scared. I've only been actually scared a couple of times in a role-playing setting, and that was one of them.
Yeah, I've played it a few times, and I feel like I've gotten kind of better as we've gone along. But it is such a good scenario, and it's so fun. And I use sound effects, and of course the Jenga tower that's endemic to Dread and stuff. But I'm really excited to play that. I'm really excited to meet a whole crew of new people. I know the LARP folks are going crazy with all of their planning right now. I've never actually been in a real LARP before, and I'm trying to drive up the nerve to actually try it out for the first time there. And there's just so much going on, and it's going to be amazing. The room rates are phenomenal. Just come out and check it out. It's going to be fantastic.
Yeah, it's going to be a ton of fun. And you're talking about the LARP. The LARP is being run by 7 different studios that are very well known in the LARP world. They're running a game called Pandemonium, and they're calling themselves Paradigm 2018 while they're all working together. But these are organizations like Joback, the Geek Initiative, Sinking Ship Creations, Hanging Land, Peculiar Crossroads, Reverie Studios. These are folks that are doing huge stuff. Some of them work on things like real royalty and New World Magiscola and Project Ascension, and the Geek Initiative does all of the digital LARP that's out there as well. So there's all kinds of cool stuff that these people do that they're bringing in, and they're all working together, which was a little bit of a feat to get everybody to work together on this particular project, but it is going to be huge, and the space is so cool that you are going to love every moment of LARPing there. And then each one of those studios is running their own mark, their own smaller LARP at the event. So you're going to have the big LARP at night, and then you're going to have all of these smaller LARPs that they're going to be running throughout the day. Joback is running a Scion LARP, and Scion being the game property created originally by White Wolf and now owned by Onyx Path Publishing, where you play Children of Gods, which is going to be cool that they're bringing that out as a LARP. There's going to be Speakeasy by the Geek Initiative, and I want to say it's Drowning Moon, which they're going to be using the Foundation Room and the bar there to run a 1920s, 1930s era Prohibition game, which is going to be cool. And it's got some horror and some otherworldly elements built into that as well. But that's just a tiny taste. I could probably talk about this for hours. And Quinn, you're going to have fun. Most of this is free-form LARP, so you don't need to know a lot of rules ahead of time. We're going to go to one of the workshops. I'm going to sit you down, workshop with you, and we're going to have a ton of fun doing that for like 20 minutes, a half hour. And then we're going to go to the event later on and have a blast.
I'm excited, if a little nervous, but I'm excited. Yeah, we also, speaking of things where you can help us out, we have the HLG Con Kickstarter.
We do. And the goal of this Kickstarter is to kind of help the event have a couple of extra funds for a few different things. The first being scholarship fund. There are some great people that want to come to the event and can't afford it, and we want to be able to extend scholarships to folks and say, hey, you have a Pandemonium ticket, come to the event, come to the LARP, enjoy yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's something that you would like to support, even if you can't come to HLGCon yourself, go to the Kickstarter, back it, help somebody else come to the event. The other layer to that is that if you're a game designer or me or a website, or you're just Josh sitting in his room doing whatever, and you want to advertise, backing our Kickstarter is a great way to get some advertising for really an inexpensive rate. We are doing social media shout outs, we're doing website posts, and we're doing actual physical advertisements in our brochure for the event. So you can get all of those different layers of advertising for what I think is a very inexpensive rate, usually under $100 for some solid advertising. And we've got a pretty big reach as a website and social media presence. So you'll definitely get a little bit of extra attention for the different things that you're doing by helping us out.
Absolutely. We also have a Patreon page wherein you can support the many blog creators that make stuff for highlevelgames.ca. For only $5 a month, you can get access to our content free as we release it. This includes one-page adventures for new authors for game systems like D&D 5th edition, 3.5 edition, Pathfinder, Savage Worlds, Cypher System, and 13th Age, all for only $1. That's for the sale. For sale if you just want to buy them. You can find all of our products on our website for download as well at highlevelgames.ca.
We also have recently been writing lots of products for the Storyteller's Vault. That's a classic World of Darkness community content creation site where you can currently write for Vampire the Masquerade or Werewolf the Apocalypse. If you've got a concept for something that you would like to either of those game lines that you've always thought this would be a great addition to the World of Darkness, you can take that and put it together in a nice template and put it up on the vault. And High Level Games has been creating what we call Beckett's Vampire Folios, which are character sheet collections to go along with Beckett's Jihad Diary, which was created by Onyx Path Publishing for Vampire 20th Anniversary Edition. The cooler thing, the thing that I'm most excited about, as cool as the folios are two books that I worked on with Lisa J. Elwood and J.C. Stearns. These books, the first one, Descendants of the Three Sisters, looks at Native American traditions from the Northeast US and some parts of Canada, and says, what if there were vampires not directly connected to the vampires of the core Vampire the Masquerade mythos in this area that were indigenous to this space? And who would they be? Where would they have come from? And what sort of clan structures would they have? And how would they have survived with the Camarilla and the Sabbat coming to New England? So that's that book, which came out of the development of Dark New England. And backtracking, Descendants of the Three Sisters was mostly written by Lisa. Lisa herself is of Lenape descent, and she looked at her some of her cultural traditions as a baseline for some of the story elements that she developed, and then developed her own creation story for those vampires, which is really well done, really well crafted, and it's only $7.99 on the Storyteller's Vault. So I recommend checking that out for an 80-page book. And then all feeds into a bigger book, which is 252 pages, called Dark New England, which was my brainchild, where I said, hey, New England got a book very early on in the Vampire and the Masquerade world, but it wasn't a great book. So I wanted to update it and make it something really interesting and really engaging. And we take a look at all of the states of New England. We create a whole ton of characters that you can use in your games, and create some specific options, and also tying in some of those elements from the Descendants of the Three Sisters book. So you get a lot of stuff for the $16.99 that Dark New England is.
Yeah, and they're phenomenal products. Please go and check them out. Write reviews, leave comments on storytellersvault.com where they can be found. They are so good. They deserve to be in your personal libraries. Go and check them out. They've been a hot seller on storytellersvault.com, so it's not going to be hard to find them. We're on the front page, right there in the hottest seller section. So please go and check them out. They are great, great products, and I'm just really proud to be part of the company that put out such a thing. And Josh, you and Lisa and JC Stearns have done a phenomenal job, and you should really be proud of the work you did.
Thanks. I really appreciate that, because at times putting it together, I didn't know at times if it was going to actually make it to the world, but I knew the Made was super good. And so getting it to the finish line and putting it out there and saying, hey, this is done, this is out there, and this really and I'm not saying my work necessarily, but Lisa's work and JC's work are super good. Like, their quality content brings the stuff that I wrote and makes it 1,000 times better. And I'm just super pleased to have helped them get their work out there a little bit more. But segueing to our next segment of Leveling Up, Quinn, what's going on for you in the gaming world right now?
I mean, summer is a tricky time to game because people are busy and stuff. That being said, so we have been clipping away on the Star Trek Adventures campaign, which has been super exciting. There was a dramatic last episode with the USS Bonaventure, and which led to the ship coming basically one bad roll away from being destroyed utterly. So yeah, it was pretty dramatic and pretty exciting. I'm also playing, GMing a Numenera campaign that has been continuing, and I'm having just a blast playing that. I've created an antagonist in the game that is a Aeon Knight and has been chasing them, and they've had like 3 encounters with her so far, and they're terrified of her, even though the last one they kind of sort of win, but it was inconclusive. And she told them that she has magic that can find them wherever they go, and so far she's been able to track them down anywhere, and it's been really, really exciting because they're always kind of looking over their shoulders, and whenever she shows up, the stress levels skyrockets for these folks. They've not faced a challenge quite like her before, and I really love creating an antagonist that brings something to the game, and it's really helpful in the Cypher system in Numenera that you can have an antagonist that doesn't just die in the first 15 minutes of meeting them.
Always a good thing.
Yeah, so that's been helpful. Also playing in a Savage Rifts campaign that has been continuing, having a lot of fun playing in that campaign as a mind melter, and really, really enjoying life there. And I've been, because I can't help myself, I've been quietly working on another campaign that I want to run, and we'll see what happens with that in the fall.
Awesome.
How about you, Josh? What's going on in gaming for you?
Absolutely nothing. So I think between the last time we recorded and part of the reason why it's been such a long time between episode recordings is my life has gotten kind of interesting and a little bit stressful in good and bad ways. Putting the convention together has made it a little bit like, okay, we got to prioritize some of the stuff related to that. And the folks that I was running my Changing Breeds game with, it got to a point where it's like, okay, everyone's work situation is making it difficult for us to get together. So we're going to take a break. And right now, at least one of my players is working every weekend for the next 6 weekends.
Oh,
And
man.
I'm going to be working a bit on the weekends for the next 5 weekends. So it's definitely going to be a situation where it's like, okay, we can't sit down and play, but I have been writing a lot. So I've been doing a lot of freelance RPG writing. And because we didn't talk about this before, another product for Werewolf the Apocalypse that I wrote for the Storyteller's Vault under HLG's imprint is Welcome to Purgatory, which is a Werewolf the Wild West adventure, which I'm very excited about because I tried to create some realistic reflections of the Wild West, of the actual West, and trying to use werewolves to create a realistic impression of that sort of space. So it was a lot of fun to put that together and to do stuff like that. But sadly, I haven't actually story told or rolled any dice recently, which is just terrible.
That's a tragedy. That is a tragedy. That's
Yeah.
a sad story.
I'm
So
hoping, I keep hoping that I'll have a Friday night online game starting, but it just hasn't happened yet. We'll see. Maybe mention, maybe afterward.
Interesting. Well, at the very least, we know that in October at HLG Con, you'll be gaming your face off. So one way or the
I
other.
won't sleep. I'm planning on maybe just having an energy drink and staying up the whole time. I'm calling it good.
Well, good luck with that. I'm gonna try to pretend like I'm in my early 20s and drink and game all the time and see how that goes. So
It'll be fun. We will enjoy it one way or the other.
One way or the other, everyone else will enjoy it.
So we've gotten together to talk about a difficult topic.
Only difficult because we've already had some of this conversation. It turned into a debate, which I believe I soundly beat you. But
I think I became polite, which is maybe not the same as having defeated me in debate. But
well, anytime an American can become polite, a Canadian is happy. So I'll take that as a victory.
I'm sorry.
I'm also sorry, but I don't know what for.
So, what is this topic that we're going to talk about now that we've prefaced it so well?
Old school versus new school gaming, right? Yeah. So I'm excited about this topic. Very excited. First of all, we want to start on a definition of terms, right? Because I think this is part of the problem we had when we were having our conversation. As I thought about it, did a lot of research, and just generally stewed. I think that we often found ourselves talking about different things. So I think that there are three kind of areas that are applied to this term old school gaming, and that is old school as a time period / edition, old school as rule sets / mechanics, and old school as versus style of play / mentality around gaming. And I think that so this style of play, mechanics, or time period is confusing to a lot of players. um, or to a lot of people having this conversation. And I think that's probably where we want to begin.
Okay. So, what is your definition of old school?
So for me, old school gaming probably has a dual definition, one of which is a time period,
Hmm.
right? And so it is a time period in gaming wherein things were not very sophisticated yet, right? And so there is
What do
an
you mean by sophisticated? Because sophisticated is a fraught term.
well, in the sense that there are modern innovations in game design that are just a little more elegant um, than the Wild West kind of that existed in the early days, right? No one there's very few games now that can really truly do something that is innovative, right? There was a time where literally everything you did was innovative, right? People were just hadn't done it before because it hadn't been a thing before. And so there was a sense that kind of there were no rules to this thing. Now here we are, 40 years on, and or 50 years on, I guess, where um, gaming has tropes, right? Gaming has, unspoken social mores. You can make a community episode about D&D and it can just be a list of in jokes for the gaming community and it can be hilarious because we get it. There was a time when none of that was true. And so for the time period piece, that is a thing for me.
Okay. So, when you're saying time period, you're talking about an era when role playing games as a concept were relatively new
Yeah.
and were socially unacceptable. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, it's probably not something that weighs on my mind about that area for this topic, but
Mhm.
yes, that is those things coincided. I will also say that it's an era wherein um, role playing games were not just new, but they were evolving rapidly.
Mhm. So, the other thing that you were talking about, though, was rules. And you talked about that a little bit, but can you speak to that maybe more? Because I'm still unclear maybe about how you're defining old school in reference to rules.
Yeah, I think this is part of where we fell down when we first talked about it, is because I started talking about a period of time and you started talking about rules.
Mm,
And my knowledge of gaming meant that your understanding of what new school gaming was mechanically wasn't that new. Right. And so that was part of the issue. So mechanically, often old school gaming, and I think this is part of what you were talking a lot about old school gaming being very mechanics heavy, very GM driven, those sorts of things. That's pretty new school for me, right? Or medium school, if you want, because of the simple fact when I'm thinking old school gaming, mechanically, I'm talking about an era where the rules were contradictory and we liked it that way, right? and we had 15 different conflict resolution ability or types in a single game, and constantly at the table a GM just had to figure it out, make a ruling, and everyone had to move on.
okay, so would you say this is true or this is not true potentially, that old school gaming is more simulationist than it is story focused?
Is it more simulation than story focused? I think in the modern sense of those words, yes. But if you think of 3.5 as in D&D as simulationist, or even Palladium as simulationist during their kind of glory days, those sorts of eras, or even Shadowrun during their kind of glory days as simulationist, that is kind of the end of the old school period for me.
Okay.
Right? Because
So
if
you're
you look
saying
at,
before, like those are included in the old school era, or those are post
they're
old school?
I think they're either new school or a transitionary period.
I think you're wrong, but that's okay.
Right. I get that you think that, because as we understand the term today, absolutely correct, right? If you look at like an indie game toolkit like Fudge, or a rules light game like Fate, those sorts
Which are
of
the same base rule system, but that's another
ish,
story.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But if you look at those systems, a bit very rule light games, very narrative driven, you can look at first edition or second edition D&D, for example, or Villains and Vigilantes in the first edition, or those sorts of things. You're like, those are way more crunchy than these are.
Mm.
That being said, when you're comparing those games to third edition Dungeons and Dragons, they're just not even the same animal.
Okay. So right now, let me do this. Let me define how I've seen new school and old school, because I think that might, at least, I think we've seen where some of our maybe our differences of opinions are, but maybe that will elucidate them a little bit more. Because
Right.
I think there's layers to this, which I think you're right to identify. Um, but I think you can't post date a term and say, oh, it meant this for back then, but it means this now. I think that's fraught with danger when we do that.
It's literally how language works, but whatever.
But if we're talking about it today, we have to anyway. Yes, you're right. You're not wrong, absolutely.
Oh.
This is how I define them. New school is much more, or old school gaming is much more focused about creating some sort of atmosphere that was true in role-playing games from about 1970 D&D chainmail era to right around the beginning of AD&D. That's the old school gaming environmental focus. And when people talk about the OSG movement, often they're talking about games that simulate that experience, or potentially the basic D&D experience within that same sort of framework. And I know there's a couple of date issues that I might be running into there, because I don't exactly remember when basic D&D came out, but it was on that time frame. And then new school is atmospherically about focusing on story, less GM involvement, more player driven games, more less conflict with the person, um, monitoring, guiding, helping assist the story, whatever their term is for that person. That would be the storyteller or the dungeon master. They're much less conflictual with the players. Instead of setting up a dungeon and having them run all the monsters, the person guiding is helping develop the story that the players want to play. So when I hear the terms, it's those atmospheric differences, which, yes, can be connected to mechanics to some degree, but is also about a sense of what is the sort of experience we want to create at our table, which is a little bit different than mechanics are.
It absolutely is. But if that is your definition, we need to understand that new school started in like 1982.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Maybe.
Because you have Ars Magica, you have Amber Diceless role playing games, you have Paranoia, you have Ghostbusters, which is one of the most influential and innovative games that ever was made on, basically because it was a joke. You have Marvel TSR's Marvel Superheroes. These kinds of games essentially invented gaming from 90 on. and everything mechanically from like a single dice or a single conflict resolution uh, model within the mechanics. Like that by itself, we need to remember is super new.
Mhm.
But also with the idea that the story is at the heart of things. Now, the period in which we have the GM or DM versus the players, I think was actually a lot shorter than people think.
Oh, I
But
disagree because that
but
period went straight out into 3.5 and 4th edition even. Like if we're
no,
talking about from Dungeons and Dragons being the leader in the space for how people game, that mentality has been true right up until then. And maybe
I
even today.
I think that we need to make a distinction there between what most people play most of the time versus what young and inexperienced players play,
Okay.
right? Because could walk into any 16-year-old's game and I'm probably going to see a GM trying to kill his players and torturing them, and the players kind of fighting against them. My experience has been most new players go through that phase, and some of
But I
them
think
have a lot of fun and then quit. Some of them move
Mhm.
beyond into a deeper understanding of role playing.
But I don't
But
think that's just younger players. I think you see people I think see people now. I'm picturing a certain scenario, but I'll be generic about it, where you walk into a friendly local gaming store, and every week the people play them versus the players using 5th edition rules. So I don't think that's a good marker necessarily of new school
maybe we
rules.
need to define what GM versus the players is then, because some of my best games that have created best stories is I've played the role of the antagonist in the fiction as well as outside of the fiction to elicit responses from my players.
Hmm.
Right up to and including watching a group of my players defeat something in spectacular fashion that I had put in front of them. And while they were hooping and hollering, wanting to build on that emotional content and sitting there going, I didn't picture that. I don't know what to do next and stuff. And I probably could have recovered a lot quicker than I did, but I wanted to give them that. And for
Hmm.
a few minutes, they beat the DM. I was just as happy with how that went as they were, right? And even in my gaming group today, people talk about, oh, be careful of the GM or else that's not really a thing,
Right.
right? And I mean, I have very deep feelings on the idea of like dealing in game with out of game problems, but I I think that's a different thing than what you're identifying. What you're identifying is a player. See, I find that two things.
Hmm.
One, if a DM wants to kill you, you're dead, right? And so the
In
fact that
theory.
your characters are alive week after week probably means he wasn't trying that hard.
But
And
but
second thing is,
okay.
every single time I see this issue come up in any Google Plus or Facebook group or conversation, the vast majority of players are like, you're on the same team. Vast majority of responses are always that. It is orthodoxy. It is the way people deal with this. And I'm in AD&D second edition. I'm never going to play that 3.5 crap groups on Facebook where they're just like, as soon as somebody pulls that, they're like, that's stupid. What are you doing?
Okay. Here's the nuance maybe that I'll bring to that because
Okay.
I think maybe that's fair to some degree, but still the sense that two things. One, in the old school gaming mentality, the GM must stick to the rules 80 to 90% of the time, with an understanding that if you're an advanced GM, maybe you pull some tricks behind the screen to make a good story that people accept but don't like. Because if you can follow the rules and still win, is the kind of lauded by some folks within that sort of mentality. But the other is that the GM runs all of the world setting. They create everything about the world and how that's managed, and the players just run their characters. They don't have control over any world elements, which does seem to be a little bit of a divide I think we could agree on about between new school and old school gaming.
Oh, yeah, I think that that's probably pretty accurate. I would find that I think that's the standard mode of play for gaming, period. Um, Keeping in mind that the big boy on the block for gaming is D&D, and it's built on that structure.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I think even that understanding could be nuanced by the fact that I don't know of almost any DMs that play for any amount of time with the same people where they're not checking in, looking for feedback at the table, even watching how people react to things and then making changes. And so people are impacting the world. And frankly, even most good campaigns are going to have something your players are doing that impacts the world, the universe of consequence, and even that is a way to change the kind of world. But what I think you're specifically referencing is often a mechanical or a understood social contract methodology for the players to do this. Now, I do think that's new school, but I think that, and I mean, new school understanding that, Ghostbusters did that.
Right.
Like when the movies were out.
But I think I think maybe that's a good point for us to address, is that a lot of what we call new school now is pretty damn old school.
Yeah.
It was in Ghostbusters. Fudge came out in the 80s, in the mid 80s. And Fudge is the backbone to Fate. And Fate is absolutely considered by most people a new school game, even though the entire backbone of Fate is something that's pretty darn old as far as games go in this sort of space.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a thing we need to maybe their terms themselves are just not good, but we'll maybe talk about that a little bit later. But I do agree with you. I think the core here is that new school gives players more narrative control, but we see that in what some people might call old school games a little bit now too, or if we call D&D an old school style game, you have inspiration, you have different elements of your character's backstory that can tie directly into the plot and become relevant. So all of gaming is inbreeding, as it were.
I mean, I could see that. I will say that I think that the divide between old school and new school, however, for me is typified by a lack of trust in the DM.
Ugh.
And I know this is a thing that you and I very much disagree on, but the reason I believe that is because, and I think that, shitty DMs in the community kind of did this to people. But I do believe that, in the sense that one of the things that typifies really old games has tended to be that we didn't have the language to even express some of the mechanics to be able to do the things that your players at the table were going to do. And so you just had to figure it out. Now, when I played first edition AD&D, and I wanted to bash in a door, it was the first D&D that really had a mechanic to do that. And it was a completely separate resolution system from basically anything else. But even before that, or even if you went to play Basic, which came out after first edition, which is a whole thing, but if you did that, you really didn't have a mechanic to do those things. And so the DM, when faced with that situation, had to deal with it. In third edition and 3.5, you could bash in a door, and the process, literally look this up. you have to consult 3 separate charts, make multiple attack rolls.
Yep.
It's a mess, but it is super simulationist and it is super codified. And if the GM doesn't follow those things, they're making a departure from the mechanics. They're not just
Right.
filling in where there's a gap and so we can all move on. There's a departure, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and I think that the reason for the heavy push into simulationist games in the early 90s, um, and I will argue that even non-simulationist, more narrativist games wherein there was such a huge giant backstory and setting and and you saw this with like the old FASA or D6 West End games, Star Wars, right, where your character sheet would include, or an NPC would include like 6 pages of backstory. That is
Mm-hmm.
a way to control those things, right? And not just leave it up to the DM or leave it up to the group. And I think that is about kind of, I want my DM to tell me a story, but I really want to know the rules of this game. And part of that is to protect people from bad DMs, I think. And part of it is that we didn't trust the narrative to flow, right? I mean, I honestly think people would have
Mm-hmm.
done a lot better playing a lot more Marvel superheroes and Amber Diceless role-playing games and stuff like that than D&D in their youth, because they would have gotten over that hangover a little bit. But in no way shitting on D&D. I love D&D.
Maybe not Amber. I don't know if you've played much of it, but from a mechanical standpoint, as an RPG, um, it's very lacking
But one of the
in
quotes
anything.
one of the quotes that I heard about Amber Diceless was that if you're opening the rulebook during the game, you've lost the spirit of it.
Yeah, that's very true. I played 3 times. I've played 3 different times Amber, and I love the world of Amber. I would go back in time and marry Roger Zelazny if he would have me. Um, for me, the world of Amber and his books are so important to me that I'm rather sad that there hasn't been a newer RPG in that world.
Right.
That said, I don't know. It's not new school, and it's not new school because it it doesn't have enough to it to move the narrative. It uh, it doesn't have anything to move the narrative, and that makes it really difficult to do anything with it.
But doesn't this contradict earlier saying that there's less of a mechanical portion? Because I just finished ranting strongly that actually the mechanical portion is huge part of the divide between these two communities. Now, part of our problem with that divide is that I think you think 3.5 is old school, and I remember the days when I wouldn't play that new stupid game because it was just a cash grab.
It's clearly an old school game, but that's a different story. Um, I think the big difference between a new school game, if we're looking at Amber as an example, and I think this is actually a good example. Let's use 2 games that people might feel are similar in some ways. Amber and Powered by the Apocalypse, but specifically Urban Shadows. So, and here's my argument here. Amber Diceless creates a narrative based decisions are left to the players and the DM and the story to decide what's the best decision to be made within them. Urban Shadows does much the same, where the MC has no system to roll any dice against the players. The players have a way to control the narrative through dice, and if they succeed, they succeed. If they fail, they still succeed, but there's implications to their successes. The reason that Amber is old school is Amber Diceless is built the same sort of atmosphere is the only word that comes to mind as a way of describing it, where you have a specific type of story that fits the RPGs of the day. And I would say that Urban Shadows has an atmosphere that fits the new school gaming, and that's so amorphous, and I respect that. So before you come down on me and like say, hey, blah blah blah, that was bullshit, I'll accept that.
No, I'm not going to say that. I just would like the record to show how many times you've argued with yourself during your arguments.
But I think that's probably because the terms are terrible. I almost called them much worse than that. I don't think they're useful. I think they're artificial constructs that people use to try to make them feel like they're part of a certain clique.
I would agree.
And
I honestly think that we'd be better off thinking of all games as indie or D&D.
oh gosh, no.
Honestly, we'd probably be better off.
Well,
because 99% of all games are essentially D&D.
Well, that's true. We know that Dungeons and Dragons runs the market, and even if it's not running the market, D&D clones.
Yeah, 13th Age is D&D, Pathfinder is D&D, the old school Renaissance or old school revival games like Castles and Crusades and Osric are D&D, and so on and so forth, right? Even Savage Worlds, it could be argued, is D&D, but
don't tell the people at Savage Worlds that, but you're probably right.
But I think that there is a big difference. Now, when we're talking like the game theory piece, like gamist, narrativist, simulationist, that gives us a better language, but it's a language to describe storytelling styles and mechanical styles, which is probably more useful than old school, new school. In the sense that no one's quite sure about it. Now, there's one piece of the old school, new school that I think we probably should spend some time on before we move on, is this style of play. Okay. Now, you did mention it a little bit with the idea that the GM is against the players. I think that is part and parcel of the style of play, but I think that there is other things going on. Right? For style of play, I don't think the line is between narrative and player control necessarily, and kind of the GM control. I think that line is a lot blurrier than we're maybe giving it credit for. I think that the line tends to be around what kinds of things happen at your table. Right? There is a style of play that is probably I'm trying to find the words to put this into to say this.
I think I know maybe what you're saying, and I have an argument to it, which is fine. And maybe I'm going to ask you this question, and if we talk about style of play, maybe as the thing as the game or the difference we're talking about, we could maybe talk about the fantasy adventure or the sci-fi adventure setup, or the discussion, philosophical interaction of concepts around a table.
Yes.
But
ish.
Yeah. Is Vampire the Masquerade an old school game?
Yes.
Or a new school game?
Old school, all the way.
Why?
Mechanically and the storytelling style itself.
See, I disagree. Not that I disagree that it's an old school game.
Rather, the storytelling style, I'm probably referencing more the writing than the game itself.
But I think that's a key thing that we've both danced around, but maybe not focused enough on.
This brings in the style of play, because though if you pick up first edition Vampire the Masquerade, And I remember when it came out, and I read it, and I just loved it. Read that. It reads like first edition AD&D mechanically.
Here it is.
Yes, and it reads like basically every late second edition AD&D setting, narratively. Now, it did interesting things, like you get to play the monsters, and this is a darker, like those things were pretty innovative for its time, especially in the way that it was done and in how well it was accepted, and it was just right for the zeitgeist of that particular era. But it's straight up old school in a lot of ways. Now, what happened at tables? It attracted, in my opinion, a particular type of gamer that was looking for something that they didn't typically find at their local D&D game.
You're right.
And those people played a particular way. And I think this is an aspect of old school versus new school. And the way those played, especially how easily it sprung into LARP, was very new school style. But if we're going to make that an aspect of new school, we need to understand that the crunchiest of games, Shadowrun, at many tables, was a new school game. D&D, in every edition, at many tables, was a new school game. Because I think that as an aspect of what this differentiation is.
Okay, so I think that's wrong all at the same time. And I'm saying it's fair because I think we have to identify games as new school or old school if we're using these terms based on the way they're written and intended to be played, not the way they're actually played at the table, because we don't know. There might be somebody that runs Monopoly like a new school RPG, for example. You know what I mean?
All I want in the world is to see that, because I cannot picture that.
I can't either, but it would be amazing. But I think the reason I brought this up, and I think it actually does help give us more definition if we wanted to use these terms, is the way a game is written, the way it's presented, identifies it more old school or new school than anything else. Because Vampire the Masquerade, I agree with you, clearly old school game. Even the 20th anniversary edition is clearly an old school game. The way it's written, the way it's designed, it's created as if it speaks to that type of game style. But that doesn't mean that people play it that way, which you're right, I think can be that people play them in a new school style using the mechanics only when they absolutely have to figure out like a resolution of some sort of
I absolutely agree in the sense in that sense, and I would say that it's easier and better and probably more accurate to speak about old school and new school gaming as like the way it's written, how it's intended to be played versus what actually happens at the table. I will say though, in the community, I think what happens at the table is very much part of the old school, new school identity of the individual members of those communities.
Yes.
And so this is probably where a lot of confusion lies for people around this term. But I agree, in trying to like categorize things, it's super unhelpful.
Yep.
Right? Because I'll stand by it. If what is happening at the table and those kinds of things is typified of these things, the crunchiest games in the world will be new school games in some groups. In my groups, basically every single game we play will be new school from that perspective, just because of who we are as gamers, the way we trust each other at the table, the kinds of plot lines we're interested in, me constantly preaching to them about what games should be or could be, those sorts of things.
Well, let's talk about that then a little bit, because we've danced around theme as an element of new school and old school, and I think theme touches on player safety, consent, and those sorts of elements as well. But what I mean by theme and then those things is that new school gaming, maybe we're saying, dives into deeper topics than just the classic hero's journey adventure.
Sure.
Okay. Maybe, because I don't
Maybe.
know if
You know what? The more I'm thinking of that, I'm not sure that's true.
yeah.
I think you would be hard pressed to find to sit Ernie Ernie Gygax down and say, is this reflective of your early experience playing in the very first D&D? Do you feel you got deeper plot lines, or is just kind of bash indoors and deal with dragons? And I think he would point to, which was his character, Mordenkainen. But he would point to the story that happened to him, and that carried him away.
Yeah.
Now, I think the reason that we fell down around, say, Amber Dice's role playing and some of that conversation was part and parcel of this.
Mm-hmm.
What really got me interested in kind of the philosophy of games was when I started trying to categorize what a role playing game is versus what a board game was.
Mm.
And what it boiled down to was essentially that rules are not it. Types of rules are not even it. What boils down to is story.
Mm.
Right?
Right.
And story can kind of happen in games, in board games and tabletop games, but even in more modern narrative driven Euro games, it's still not quite the base of the game. You're still playing a card game or something.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
I think you could say that an element of that, and I don't mean to derail you, but an element to pull out specifically about that is that a board game, the narrative is tied into the stuff that you do at the table, like the
sure.
figures or the cards or whatever. And in a role-playing game, the narrative is tied more into the player's decisions.
I would agree in the sense that, especially in the sense that if you boil it down to the difference between this is that we're actually constructing a story together.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that in 1974, when you're sitting down in Geneva, Wisconsin, and Gary Gygax is sitting behind, you know, he used to do this. He used to pull behind some pulled out file cabinets so he couldn't see the table and the table couldn't see him, and he'd DM that way. And one person at the table would be the speaker of the table telling him what they would do, and then he would respond back. Anyways, we've come a long way.
Yes,
early
obviously.
early DM screen. But I mean, I think that the thing that kept those wargamers coming back to that table was suddenly that they were imagining a fiction.
Mm-hmm.
They're imagining this great story, this epic thing happening in their games. And so that piece of it, I don't think you're going to be able to find a game that's you're like, well, that doesn't really happen. I don't know that you're even going to be able to say it happens more or less in these games.
You're right.
Because it's such an unquantifiable thing that happens in the mind.
Yes, I agree with that, because I think essentially for any role-playing game, regardless of the type of narrative you're telling, you're right. A large portion of that narrative happens in a different part. We'd have to do an MRI to check the science of this, but I think it plays into a different part of the brain than constructing the story around a board game.
Yeah.
Around a board game or a card game, you're constructing your strategic decisions. Even if you're imagining, you know, Colonel Mustard in the ballroom, at some point it's not the same thing as my character, Colonel Mustard, is in the ballroom right now trying to make a decision about who murdered Mr. Body. There's just a constructive difference in that mentality between a role-playing game and a board game.
I agree. Can I tell a fun anecdote?
Sure.
So a bunch of my role-playing buddies go to Tabletop Cafe, which is a tabletop place here in Edmonton, and we're sitting down. It was a friend of mine's birthday. He's a huge board game guy, and so we all went. He's also part of our gaming group, and we sat down, and we didn't know most of these board games, and we're surrounded by a whole bunch of people who are really passionate about board games. And so we're like, well, what do we want to pull out? And somebody suggested Betrayal on the House at the House on the Hill, right? And we're like,
Hmm.
okay. My gaming group had backstories and motivations for their characters in the first 5 seconds. We were making contra-rational decisions based on what we imagined our characters doing in these things. It was driving the one guy that was teaching us the game nuts because he was such a strategic thinker. And we're just doing these different things. Like one person's running away from everybody because why would you bring an 8-year-old girl to this place on her birthday? And like all of these things, it just went crazy. And then he's like, you're never going to be able to deal with this game if you don't play it right. And when the betrayal happened, we found out that we were facing a dragon. And we're like, Mom, we got this. We know exactly how to solve this problem. And he was like, oh, you guys suck. I hate you so much. And we did. We dealt with the dragon while we went home. We were fine.
Nice. That's amazing.
Of all the things to pull, the dragon, we're like, ah!
No big deal.
So you got the spear and you got the armor. Okay, we got this thing.
Nice.
Yeah, it was great.
Wow. I can 100% picture that. By the way, I am now like seriously in the back of my head not able to put down the idea of crafting Monopoly into a new school RPG.
Oh,
like
jeez.
I might message you like 3 weeks from now, like, Quinn, I've got the system.
I've got a draft.
That said,
our new indie RPG, Monotony.
Oh, jeez. Yeah, we've talked about this a lot in a lot of different ways. But I think the last thing we should talk about real quick is the element of player consent and safety at the table, and maybe the focus there between old school and new school games.
Sure.
I would argue that everyone cares if they care about these things, regardless of whether it's new school or old school. But I would say it's become a requirement in the new school era to care about the X card and care about mechanics that allow people to fade to black or call an end to a scene or do anything like that. What do you say to that sort of assertion?
If we're codifying by playing the games as they're written and intended to play, that's patently untrue.
Okay.
Because it's written into almost no games.
Hmm.
It's something people make decisions at the table to play and do. In fact, I'm struggling to think of one where it's actually written in. Oh, no, thank you, Evo, but Monty Cook Games.
Mm-hmm.
They have the X card written in. That being said, if we're talking about the culture of these communities, it certainly is that thing. There is a distinct tonal shift, in my experience, in Facebook groups and at different tables between these communities. And it's not, it's a little more intense in the old school gaming communities, the self-identified old school gaming renaissance or communities. It's a little more intense. And these things in some of those communities, and I don't want to paint anyone with a broad brush, in some portions of these communities, these things are scorned. They're seen as typifying a degradation of a once pure hobby. And there's a lot of reasons for that, some of which are understandable, others less so. But I think that that is more true in that community than it is in new school games. In new school gaming communities, it is a lot more, I don't want to use the word understanding as though people in the other community aren't. That's not what I'm saying. People are a lot more aware, if you will, of these issues at the table, and they tend to build them into the social contract at the table, into their table management. I think that is probably true for the majority in the majority of the time. I will say, however, that people, and I know this happens, play the most new school mechanically games they can, and they'll play it without caring about those issues. And people will play hardcore OD&D and just be like, we're checking with everybody. Is there anything on the table that we want to make sure to avoid in the storyline? Just remember, if you want to give this particular signal or this particular message to me about something that's bothering you, let me know, and we'll move the story. That's not anything that you'll be called out for. That is something that we encourage. So if we stick to our own set of definitions, that can't be part of it. It certainly seems to be more ingrained in one group's style of play.
I agree. And I think there's a misconception that old school means you're a grognard that doesn't care about the other people at your table, except as accessories to your own fulfillment.
Absolutely untrue.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely
completely.
Untrue. And to be clear, I don't think has ever really been true. I think that socially, a lot of issues have evolved over time. There are gaming themes that I have GM'd in my life that I would never do again, that I'm not proud of, but I hadn't thought of those issues before, or I didn't realize how they might affect other people. But there was never a time in my life where I sat down with my dear friends to play a game and I was like, I really want to hurt this person across from me. Right? That was never a thing. And if it is a thing at any table, like, that person just, you need to cut out of your life, because that's predatory behavior. That has nothing to do with gaming.
Yep. I think that there are issues in the games community, which we've talked about on Leveling Up before.
Yep.
But just because someone likes a hack and slash old school D&D style, basic D&D or one of the basic emulators, doesn't mean that they aren't really interested in, progressive social situations and understanding people more effectively. They
Absolutely.
might just enjoy the other elements of the game. But I think there's a perception that if you're into that, then you must be into chainmail bikinis and the objectification of people. It could be true. In some ways, there are people like that, but it doesn't mean that the entire community is like that by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and I think that we need to understand also that I think that most of these players, even players that would sit across from me and say, I don't care about the issue of, say, chainmail bikinis, right? It's probably not because they hate women, right? And it's probably not, for most of the people, if you sit them down, ply them with vodka, and get to 2 in the morning and have an honest conversation with them, it's probably not anything about anger or hatred or objectification, but it exists in a way of gaming that they imagine where everything is exaggerated and hyper whatever, right? And so they would see no difference between Conan in a loincloth or Red Sonja in a chainmail bikini necessarily. And now I think that many people are coming to understand that there is a difference in perception and power and gender issues certainly at play there. But I do want to get away, like, bashing into that community and trying to force yourself into their game to change them from the inside is poor form. If everyone sits at a table and decides they want to play a particular style of play, hack and slash, and then you go off and do something different, you're probably going to be a drag at the table. and it's going to cause bad feelings. And even though I am a very big proponent of calling a thing what it is when I see it, and when I see problematic things, I want to be able to point those things out. I think jumping into those communities and screaming at people serves primarily to radicalize those communities. I don't think you're actually changing hearts and minds there.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult conversation with lots of layers.
Yeah.
And I would like to engage that, but I would rather engage that in a longer conversation than I think we can here. So for anyone that hears me say that and thinks I'm copping out, I am holding Quinn to have that conversation during a leveling up episode, but I think we need a full hour to really dive into that and talk about how we build communities maybe at the table, and how we build communities online, and how we talk to people online, and how we change people's opinions about things like new school and old school gaming, or if they like 4th edition D&D or 5th edition D&D. And I think those strategies
or
are things.
Hunter the Reckoning, even.
Yeah, maybe not. But we at least can, I think, we can extrapolate those things into other elements of our lives, which is why I want to be careful about how we approach that conversation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we did communities in first season of this podcast, and I would be happy to do a second revisit. But you're right, it's too big of a conversation to have in a short clip. That being said, I think we're kind of coming to the end of our time here. I think that the listeners will agree with me that I was right about everything, and that Josh was wrong, except wherein he agreed with me.
Mm-hmm. Maybe they wouldn't. I'm sure all of them will say, you know, that Josh guy, even as incoherent as he is, I agree with him. I think the thing is that it sounds like we agree on is that the terminology we use is wrong.
Yeah.
That new school, old school is bad terminology because it creates a dichotomy that is impossible to parse out effectively.
Right.
So we agree with each other, and everyone can go home now. Thanks. Bye.
Yeah. But people more agree with me, though.
I'm sure. So let's move on to our segment of Leveling Up, and that is, what are you reading right now, Quinn?
Well, since we haven't recorded in a while, I have a backlog of things that I wanted to talk about, and they're all gaming things.
Good.
So I bought 50 Fathoms from Pinnacle Entertainment Group, and this is famous for having the first plot points adventure in it, and I primarily bought it for that reason. It's quite interesting. I'm not that huge into pirate-themed role-playing games, but it is really nice. And if you are looking for a Savage World setting wherein you're going to have a ship and be able to engage in piratey type things, as well as have almost zero GM setup for anything you're going to have to do in this setting, this is it. Because almost every single place in the setting, if they go there, there's a notation to a paragraph at the back of the book where you're going to find a thing to do there. And that's phenomenal. I also got Star Trek Adventures Beta Quadrant Source Book, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. It is one of the most gorgeous role-playing game books I've ever seen in my life. And it has a phenomenal picture of Klingons and Andorians playing hockey, which is exciting on so many levels for this Canadian. It is incredibly good book. I also got Star Trek Adventures, The Command Division, which I read. Cool. And it provides multiple tiers of play for doing commands or even squadrons or doing mass combats or doing command campaigns where you play a command, like an admiral and his staff, various different things like that. Very cool. The one downside I would give for either of these books is they bring in like 3 dozen new space frames for you to use in your game, and show pictures for about an eighth of them,
Mm.
which is super disappointing because honestly, that's what most people probably bought the book for, is that artwork. And then last but definitely not least, the Ninth World Guidebook by Monte Cook Games, which is an addition to the core setting that expands on some areas and moves it beyond the little corner that you get in the core setting. And it is phenomenal. It talks about some of the astrological things in this sense of like it's a billion years in the future is the setting. So one of the things is, well, the sun would be too bright for Earth to sustain life. Well, clearly somebody's changed the sun at some point in the past. There is a green ring around the moon. No one knows why. Mars is still visible to the naked eye, but it's green and blue, right? One of the planets is missing, but they don't know because it's just never been in the sky, right? Different things like that are fascinating to bring to spark the imagination. So all of those things I have been reading. What have you been reading, Josh?
Well, I got my Kickstarter copy of Beckett's Jihad Diary, which the print-on-demand version, which is the one I've been using to do work with, is like 5 inches thick. And the Kickstarter version is much slimmer, with the same page count, and it's gorgeous. And I don't act me, I'm not going to get up and grab it, but I will say that it's a great book. If you got a chance to be a Kickstarter backer, you deserve to be one. And if you didn't, that most of the Kickstarter books that Onyx Path creates eventually end up on Indie Press Revolution, and they have about 100 copies left over that they print intentionally to sell on there. So if you're interested in getting one of those, it'll probably be available eventually. But what I've been reading a lot of recently are mage books. And specifically, I'm reading one historical novel, or it's not a novel, historical evaluation. I don't know what you call this, but it's called John Dee and the Empire of Angels. And it looks at John Dee, who was a magician and court employee for Elizabeth I. And he created the tradition of Enochian magic. And the book is written by Jason Louv, L-O-U-V, who is a modern magician. And it looks at Dee's work with angels and communicating with angels, and it says the basic premise is that his work doing that helped to shape the modern world that we live in, which I'm making no arguments of agreement or disagreement with that. I'm just using it as a baseline for the other reading that I'm doing, which is Mage: The Awakening, 2nd edition, which I had gotten into Mage: The Awakening 1st edition, but never really played it because most of the people I knew weren't into the quote unquote new world of darkness, so I never got into it. But reading these two things at the same time gives me tons of cool ideas on what to play in a Mage: The Awakening setting, which is a modern urban fantasy wizardry type setting, but very much a horror urban fantasy setting, not Harry Potter or more like The Magicians, the TV show would be a good example. And at the same time, I'm also reading Mage: The Ascension 1st edition, which is very much a different game than 2nd edition Mage: The Ascension or Mage: The Ascension or Mage 20th Anniversary, because it was developed completely from a different framework. It was designed from, I think, I would argue that it was designed from a sense of Highlander and shows like that kind of had magic attached to the world, but it wasn't kind of this active principle that mages were directly interacting with. It had a little bit less philosophy. It still had some, but more of a pulp or pop philosophy. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is like a core book for Mage First Edition. You can really feel that, like it's about identity, but less so like Hegelian philosophy and much more like what does it mean to be a mechanic, and what does it mean to be someone that uses the martial arts in your day-to-day sort of life. It's a really interesting look at the world, and it's interesting that it changed so drastically from that first edition book to even the first supplement book, vastly different because of the developer that was in charge of the game line. So my rant is that I'm thinking about Mage a lot. In the end, that's what I've been reading.
That's exciting. I've never actually played Mage, and it's one of those ones where I found out more about it, and I really wanted to give it a try. I've just never had the opportunity.
It's I'm going to say it's my favorite World of Darkness game. That said, if I'm reading Werewolf actively, I'll say that's my favorite World of Darkness game.
Yeah.
So the two are very close in competition for me for games I love the most.
I get that.
Yeah.
All right. So I do want to end this off by welcoming the newest member of our podcast affiliate network. These podcasters have joined the High Level Games community, the Pagan Angel Network, a Call of Cthulhu-based actual play with some other more experimental episodes. Check them out on our website at highlevelgames.ca/podcasting network or www.paganangelnetwork.com. In keeping with High Level Games' mission to try and get as much attention as possible to awesome people producing great content. If you are interested in becoming part of our podcast affiliate network, send us a note on the contact section of our website or email us at hlgpodcast@gmail.com for further information.
Touching back on what we talked about at the beginning of this episode, if you are not coming to HLGCon, I'm very sad. So come to HLGCon, go to hlgcon.com and learn more about the convention. We have a bunch of great guests of honor, in particular Chris Spivey, who is the creator of Harlem Unbound, which is an ENnie nominated book. It's nominated in, I want to say it was 8 different categories.
It's huge.
It's amazing. It's such a beautiful game, and he's going to be running Harlem Unbound. If you would like to play in a Harlem Unbound game, you can back our Kickstarter and get a chance to sit down at a table with Chris. That's really the only guaranteed way that we can say yes, you will 100% get a chance to sit at a table with him. He's going to be running a few different games at the convention, but the Kickstarter helps us go, yes, these will be the 6 people that will sit down and Chris and play a game with him. So please check that out. But also Erica Skirpin, who is well known within the LARP community. She is a genius when it comes to looking at community design and safety and how to build good LARP, period. She writes a lot of amazing stuff. She creates a lot of great LARP. And she's one of our guests of honor. You'll get a chance, if you back the Kickstarter, to LARP with her. Up to 10 people can get a specific close-knit LARP session with her. And she also wrote some Changing the Dreaming. So if you're a World of Darkness fan, you can geek out with her about that, which I will be doing. And the last but not least, Jason Andrew, who is one of the head writers at By Night Studios, creating Vampire the Masquerade LARP, Werewolf, Changeling. He's also written for Shadowrun and everything. It's hard to say like all the different lines that he's worked for. The only company I'm 98% certain he hasn't written for is Wizards of the Coast. If there is a game out there, he has at one point probably written something for.
That's so exciting. Please come to HLGCon. I want to see everybody. I want to talk to you. I want you to come up to me and to sit down and have a drink or a coffee or a pop or a whatever of your choice and tell me all about your campaign and nerd out with me on mine, and let's just get to know each other. I'm really excited to be in the same physical meet space as people, and I really, really want to build the community that we've been building online in person. And so many people that are involved with high level games are going to be there. Different podcasters are going to be there from our podcast affiliate network. A whole bunch of people that write for us are going to be there. Different authors that have produced products with us, different authors that do blog posts for us. It is going to be phenomenal. So please come out and check it out. We want to see you. And you'll know me because I'm trying to convince Josh that my name tag will just be he runs this shit.
Maybe.
We'll see how it goes.
Maybe. Yeah, I'm thrilled to get an opportunity to do this event. As crazy it is making me, I have absolutely seen Cthulhu in my dreams a few times while organizing this event. But that said, it's going to be fabulous. The stuff that we're running, it just blows me away every time I take a look at it, because it's really phenomenal, phenomenal construction of game stuff that's going to be there. So it's going to be a ton of fun.
So exciting.
Cool. Well, let's end this episode badly.
Perfect.
Okay. So we should be saying let's level up, I think, right? We haven't done this in a while. All right. So
1, 2, 3. Let's
level up.
That was terrible.
That was a little bit better than usual. Come on.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.